Alright, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. And as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD, or Application and Website Development Program, and in particular the AWD 1111.NET Framework with Web Databases class, I am creating a series of video presentations based off of the book for the AWD 1111 class for the fall 2019 semester. As you can see on the screen right now, that book is Pro-ASP.NET MVC 5, which is an APRES text from Mr. Adam Freeman. And I'm in Chapter 24 out of 27. And I'm up to page 680, where the author says here, model binding is an elegant bridge between the HTTP request and the C# methods that define the actions. Most MVC apps rely on model binding to some extent, including the sample app that we put in. So I did this. In fact, I went and looked at all 4 of them. Alright, so the URL contained in the person ID looked like this, which meant the home controller, the index method, and the first record. Alright, so it says the MVC framework translated that part of the URL and used it as the argument it called on the index. The process by which the URL segment was converted to the int method argument is an example of model binding. So, in what follows, the author will show the process that this simple demonstration initiated, then I'll move on to explain some more complex parts of model binding. Alright, the process that leads to model binding begins when the request is received and processed by the routing engine. The author says he has not changed the routing configuration for the example, and the default route was used for the request. Back in chapters 15 and 16, the author defined in detail how routes are defined. All right. For the model binding process, as the author says here, the important part is the ID, optional segment variable. When we navigated to our URL, all right, that number 1 that was on the end, that was our parameter. The default action invoker, controller action invoker, which we talked about in chapter 17, relies on model binders and model binding to generate the data objects required to invoke the action. All right. Model binders are defined in the iModelBinder interface right here. And the author says we'll come back to this later. All right. There can be multiple model binders in an MVC app, and each binder can be responsible for binding 1 or more data types. For the example in this section, the action invoker examines the index method and finds that it has 1 int parameter. It then locates the binder responsible for int values and calls its associated bind model method. The model binder is responsible for providing an int value that can be used to call the index method. As the author says, I will show you some examples of custom binders later in the chapter, along with a few other things. All right. Using the default model binder. Although an application can define model binders, most rely on the built-in or default model binder. As it says, this is the binder that is used by the action invoker when it cannot find a custom binder to bind the type. By default, it's going to search these 4 locations for the matching parameter name in this order. Request.form, and as it says, that's the values provided by the user in the form elements. Route data.values, the values obtained using the application routes. Request.queryString, the data included in the query string portion of the request URL. And request.files, files that have been uploaded as part of the request. The locations are searched in order. For example, In the simple example, it looks for an ID like this: request.form, route data.values, request.query_string, request.files. The search is stopped as soon as a value is found. All right, and the author says here, when relying on the default model binder, it is important that the parameters for the action method match the data property being looked for. All right, binding to simple types, starting on the bottom of page 682. When dealing with simple parameter types, the default model binder tries to convert the string value, which has been obtained from the request data, into the parameters type using the system.componentModel.typeDescriptor class. If the value cannot be converted, for example, if we supplied a value of apple, the word apple, for a parameter when it requires an integer, then the default model binder won't be able to bind to the model. Okay, and they show an example of this on the top of page 684, where the author actually did run this, and for the parameter, rather than putting in an integer, put in the word apple. The model binder is able to use null as the value for the ID argument to the index method, but the code inside the action doesn't check for null values. We could fix that by explicitly checking for nulls, but the author says I can also set a default value. So in our home controller, we can set a default value here in our index, where we say int ID, for example, equal 1. Now what you'll notice when we do a file save all, if I go and run this again, previously we had to supply a value for the parameter. Now we don't have one, so it's going to default to 1 as shown in figure 24-4 on the bottom of page 684. There we go. Now the author makes a good point here on page 685, where he says, you know, that's all fine and dandy, that's all well and good, etc. But said, bear in mind we've solved the problem of non-numeric, but what about out of range? What if we put in -1, or what if we put in 500? It says this will allow the action method to call the index method with a real value, but it'll still result in an error because we don't perform any additional checks. The author recommends you pay attention to the range of parameter values and test accordingly. Culture sensitive parsing. The default model binder class uses culture-specific settings to perform type conversions for different parts of the world. For example, dates are handled differently in different countries. Binding complex types on the bottom of 685. When the action method parameter is a complex type, in other words, any type which cannot be converted using the type converter class, then the default model binder class uses what's called reflection to obtain the set of public properties and then binds to each of them in turn. To demonstrate how this works, we've added 2 new action methods into the home controller as shown on page 686. So let's grab these, and right before we get to the bottom of our home controller, the create person overload without parameters creates a new person object and passes it to the view method, which has the effect of rendering /views/home/createperson.cshtml. All right, and in our createperson.cshtml file, do we have that? Looking at our views here, I don't see a create person in here, so I don't think I really want it under home, but I can always move it. So let's add, in fact, let me check something here. Maybe it is there. So let's add a view. Call this view create person. Remove the boilerplate code. And let's add the code that is shown here down toward the bottom. Toward the bottom of page 686. I don't know where that's from. I have no idea how that happened. Control copy. That looks better. I'm gonna not worry about moving these on separate lines, so I guess the key takeaway for us is this line here in blue. The view renders a simple set of labels and editors for the properties of a person object and contains a form element that posts the editor data back to the create person action method. That's the one that's been decorated with the HTTP post attribute. The method uses the /views/home/index view to display the data the form contained. So as you can see how the new index actions work, the new index methods work, by starting the application and going over to /home/createperson as shown on page 687. So let's do our file save all. Let's start from the index file, view it in the browser. All right, we want to go here home and we want to go over to create person. All right, we'll come in here and we'll give this person an ID of 100, first name of Peter, a last name of James, and guest for the role. Click submit. There they are. So as the author says here, we've created a different kind of model binding situation when we post the form back to the create person method. The default model binder discovers that the action method requires a person object and processes each of the properties in turn. For each simple type of property, the binder tries to locate a request value just as it did in the previous example. So when it encounters the person ID property, it looks for a person ID data value which it finds in the form in the request. If a property requires another complex type, the process is repeated for the new type. Now, let's try this and do create person. Let's go back here to index and go to 1 Did this before. Now let's try 100. All right. And it says sequence contains no elements, so it doesn't like something about what I just put in there. Interesting. So 1 works, 2 works, 3 works, whoops. 4 works. How about 5? Nope. Same error. All right, before continuing on with this creating easily bound HTML, I think this is a pretty good stoppage point. It's at 16 minutes, so I'll see you in the next lesson.